I'm Alex Mozet, and welcome to Winner Take All, where we talk about the constant battle to fight back and win against big tech. I'm really pleased to be joined by Mike Matthys today, the co-founder of the First and 14th Institute. Mike, great to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Why don't we just start off? What is the First and 14th Institute? And, I presume it'd probably be just a good refresher. What do the First and 14th Amendments actually speak to?
Right. So the First Amendment is regarding free speech and free press, among some other freedoms. The 14th Amendment is related to due process and fair and speedy due process. So we think both of those are related to how big media, needs to handle users with regard to speech moderation and censorship concerns. We started First and 14th this year in February because I live out in Silicon Valley, and Northern California is probably the most liberal-leaning part of the country. I think most people would probably accept that. Most of my friends and colleagues, as you can imagine, are liberal. And my local representative is Anna Eshoo in the House of Representatives. And Anna Eshoo and another representative nearby named Jerry McNerney wrote a letter. You may remember this happened to Comcast, Cox, AT&T, DirecTV, Amazon, and basically asked these TV channels to explain, why are they carrying conservative news content, for example, Fox News or others. And, when I spoke to my friends in Northern California, most of them, as you can imagine, they really don't like Sean Hannity. They really hate Fox News or Newsmax. They can't stand this, but they almost universally felt that was inappropriate, that was wrong. And so we decided to form our institute and take some actions, including we did a professional voter survey just in our liberal-leaning area to determine how people felt about these kinds of censorship issues.
So what happened with that, Mike?
So what we found is in an area that's 45 to 25 Democrat versus Republican, and where we created a survey response that was demographically accurate. It was more than 60% of the registered voters felt that Anna Eshoo's letter was wrong. More interesting was that 67% felt it was wrong for the government to try to discern, the difference between truth and falsehoods. And similar strong majority felt it was inappropriate for the government to punish or in any financial way incentivize media to publish or not publish preferred or unpreferred content, based on government's partisan politics. And
then what? She kind of took the gas off and stopped putting pressure on as after seeing that. Did you have any impact once you surfaced these results?
It's hard to know. I'm sure she saw the results. It was locally published in the regional newspapers in the area. We had it on some websites, and strangely though, there was very little response to her letter and her hearings in general. So I suspect the political leaders in Congress kind of put the kibosh on that whole direction because they probably saw similar survey results that said that was a pretty unpopular direction to go in. Government shouldn't be so, openly advocating for censorship.
Yeah. She was too blatant about it. That was the problem, right? We're like a frog in the, on the stove. You got to slowly heat the thing up. You can't be so brash, and then people are going to be, obviously that's inappropriate. You got to slowly turn up the heat. So I guess she needed a little bit more tact in her censorship approach.
Yeah, the people in the area who follow politics and, as you say, partisanship, they were surprised because she's quite well known. As a backbencher, she's been a quiet and not very active backbencher for the party since the 1990s, at least, or more. And So people were a little shocked that she actually was the one who authored such a controversial letter.
It dovetails with something that we've talked a lot about on the show, which is that big tech, big media, I feel like they're trying to make Americans and the public feel that they're in the minority. I don't know where you net out on this, probably especially with that survey. I feel like the majority of Americans see what's going on, are not okay with what's going on, are smart, and can understand that big tech is overstepping their boundaries time and time again. It seems like your survey would echo that. How do you feel about it?
There have been some surveys, national surveys, where even 59% of Democrats said big tech has too much power. And we have a situation now with unelected small number of executives who have their own business agenda making decisions that are affecting our ability as a country to have public conversation. The online media has absolutely become the 21st century town square or the 21st century village green, that the country founders might have thought of. And as these companies have become monopolies, if Google decides they don't want a website's results to show up on their searches, that website absolutely disappears off the face of the earth. They've got 90% of search. They have a similar percentage of video, user-generated video with YouTube. Facebook has 90% when you integrate Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook together of social media. So it's like they're available for censorship and propaganda. And we have Amazon with 80% of retail book sales. So what has happened is, these companies have rather opaque standards of how they moderate and determine which speech should be allowed. And when they take actions against some users and not others, it creates the appearance that they're not being fair to all users. And I think what we've seen is a lot of people are unhappy. In fact, I'll tell you, Alex, I believe even the executives of these companies are unhappy. Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and Sundar Pichai from Google, they went to these hearings in March in the House, in the Congress, and you had one side of the aisle literally yelling at these guys saying, you need to censor more information. And the other side was yelling, you guys have got to stop censoring us, conservative opinion or point of view, so to speak. So these guys really can't win. And actually Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg has come out and published articles saying, please give us direction and regulation to help us stop being the arbiters, of what should be acceptable on the internet. And what has happened is these platforms have literally come out and said, hey, we're going to cover our ass and we will tell users the reason we blocked content or censored a user is based on quote unquote authoritative sources. This comes up again and again in COVID, information, medical information about COVID, and they rely on the WHO and the CDC. And now, as time goes by, we constantly see the WHO and the CDC changing their minds about information, and they're not completely nonpartisan, or they don't have their own political agendas. And CDC and WHO is government. So we now have a situation where government is setting standards for speech that these monopoly platforms are applying. So what we end up with is government setting speech standards, which is exactly what the First Amendment was designed to prevent.
This has been going on, long time before COVID. There have been religious communities. There have been, for example, the entire crypto community has been censored for years by big tech. This is just the kind of latest iteration. It gets worse and worse, right? The censorship, and either you're kicked off permanently, you're suspended temporarily, you're shadow banned, your posts are muted in terms of discovery, right? There's a whole spectrum of censorship now these days. But COVID certainly has, I mean, they already opened up Pandora's box. You can't close Pandora's box. They've crossed that delicate line of being from platform to publisher. They're no longer a neutral platform business as I would define it. And you can't go back, which is really sad. And it really goes against the entire proposition of what these business models are supposed to do, which is supposed to connect and facilitate the exchange of information and ideas. Now you can't walk it back. And I think they are only going to get worse and more aggressive in their censorship. Overall, I'm optimistic about how this all ends out. But they specifically, the big tech monopolies, I think are only going to be more abrasive and more controlling. What do you think the future holds?
I think without some change in policy, you're correct. And I think the incentives are there for these companies when they make their decisions. It's a lower risk to censor something rather than to allow it if it's controversial content at all. There is a government, a law or policy that is referred to as Section 230. It's part of the Communications Decency Act from the 1990s. And it was designed to facilitate the growth of the internet as information companies where, email companies, websites with comment section, but all sorts of internet companies have user-generated content, and the law, the Section 230, gives them immunity so that they can't be sued for harmful content that they're not responsible for, but they simply, enable as an online platform. And what has happened, as you just mentioned, is these companies have recognized that Section 230 actually gives them almost complete immunity if they want to censor stuff, because what's written in there is a term called otherwise objectionable content, which nobody knows what that means. It's not defined. And so they can't be sued because they claim whatever they censored is objectionable content. And, that's a subjective standard. So if we tweak Section 230, that will have a major impact, I think, on how these companies make decisions. The other thing is the government today threatens to break up these companies. As you know, there's both sides of the aisle have their own reasons to want to break up these monopolies, and these companies want to resist that. I believe it will get worse. The censorship will get worse if these companies detect that doing the censorship bidding of the current political party in power, which is the Democrats, will help their business avoid being broken up. But, everything changes every 4 to 8 years in this country, as you know. And I was involved about 12 years ago in Silicon Valley in the privacy policy issues, because, it was not that long ago, websites and all these companies really did not publish privacy policies and make those available to users. And they just wanted everybody to, have an opt out, and there was a lot of publicity around the idea that the government should start regulating these guys and force an opt-in model, which, as you know, is very bad for advertising business models because nobody opts in. And they were quite motivated. These companies were quite motivated to avoid heavy-handed government regulation. And so that's why they very rapidly adopted privacy policies and published them and followed them. So this is an example of industry self-regulation motivated not because they wanted to be necessarily more sensitive to private information, but by business issues. They did not want the government to regulate them. So I suspect that if things are not today going to change, I don't believe, in the current administration and the current makeup of Congress. But one of the things that we're doing as an institute is we are actually talking to some people in the government and in Congress, as well as in some of these companies, to just try to understand what these companies are thinking, but also particularly understanding how folks in Congress are thinking and some of the staff and some of the committees.
You're saying you don't think that anything's going to change with the current state of Congress. So, we've covered on the show the, handful of bills that have come out of the House Judiciary Committee. Are you essentially implying that your confidence in those bills to eventually make their way through the winding road that is, the legislature is pretty low for anything to actually ultimately get passed and affected into law?
I believe it's very low because, as you alluded to earlier, strangely, the left side of the aisle seems right now to be mostly for censorship, and they believe it's helpful for their cause. And some of the people I've talked to said that there are thoughtful people in Democratic Party who recognize that censorship is bad for the country, but right now they have a very vocal, powerful, part of their party which is demanding this, and it's hard for them to say, hey, we're going to cooperate with a few Republicans to try to solve this problem. That's just a difficult situation to imagine right now. Things will have to change after the next elections, I think, before there will be real movement on these issues.
And then Lina Khan, right? There's a lot to do about her appointment at the head of the FTC. We've been supportive of that appointment, but skeptical of her ability to affect change, because it seems like her position is that the FTC is somewhat powerless and that she needs new laws to be passed to give her the power to do what she wants to do, which is ultimately regulate big tech. I would disagree with that stance. I do think that the FTC has plenty of power and precedent with existing laws in place, but it seems like she does not, or she certainly is not as bullish on being able to successfully use those laws. So those are basically the two irons in the fire right now from a government response to this would probably be the handful of bills coming out of the House Judiciary Committee and Lina Khan at the FTC. The DOJ just seems to be spinning in endless circles. So sounds like you're also not as bullish on Lina, or what's your opinion there?
I don't know Lina in detail. I know she's, as you said, she's motivated to regulate big companies and seems to be not happy with large companies existing. I believe, and our institute believes, the government should not be involved with regulating speech standards. I articulated some problems with these companies regulating it on our behalf, but I think it would be even worse for the FTC or the FCC or some other new agency to be invented to try to start regulating speech standards, because that will obviously inevitably lead to political partisanship and not something that makes sense. So our sense is we need to find a way for industry to have a market-driven or a industry-regulated model for how they regulate free speech and censorship standards.
What do you think about Florida's governor, Ron DeSantis? I don't know if it was a bill or kind of executive order protecting creators that are, I guess, residents of Florida being silenced or censored by big tech.
Well, I thought it was an excellent, it was a law, by the way. It was passed by the legislature and he signed it. And part of it was to protect Florida politicians who want to get their message out, because he recognized that these platforms, if they decided, and I think they did for one woman running for Congress in Florida, whose name escapes me, but they could literally take a politician off the air, so to speak, a candidate off the air, in an election. The challenge is that for a state, this stuff is, there was one court that came out already and said that that violated some kind of a federal commerce standard, that this this category of law is a federal commerce type of an issue as opposed to a state issue. But I applaud the effort. And I actually think it would be helpful for other states if they have the political ability to pass something like that, because all of this is leading up to something. This is leading up to a head. Something is going to be the straw that bakes the camel's back, you know. And if the states start making clear that, you know, the people are not happy with censorship, I think that will help.
What's interesting, you look at Poland. They've enacted, I think, legislation. They're like justice minister. They can fine tech monopolies up to $2 million for each occurrence where they take off a creator inappropriately. Australia, we saw the Australian government strong arm Google and Facebook to pay the media publishers in Australia more fairly, right? Because Google and Facebook were cramming down what they wanted to pay for news in Australia. And basically Australia said, we're going to ban unless they capitulated. And ultimately, guess what? They did. And they came to the table. I wonder if you did one of your polls in, say, the state of Florida to say, hey, should the state of Florida have the ability to go to the mat with Facebook and Google and say, hey, unless you treat creators fairly and stop this censorship mumbo jumbo for, you know, Floridian residents, if you keep having these transgressions, we'll ban you from operating in the state of Florida. We'll ban Facebook or Google from the state of Florida. How do you think that would play?
I think it would be difficult because these companies are, you know, truly monopolies. And as you're well aware with tech background, there are certain industries that just want to naturally be monopolies. You know, eBay wants to be a monopoly because if you're selling something, you want to sell on the network with the biggest platform of buyers. And if you're a buyer, you go where there's the biggest platform of sellers. So, you know, Google and Facebook, Twitter, I mean, these are natural monopolies. So Florida, if it's like, okay, the citizens of Florida can no longer use Google, I mean, that will just cause absolute chaos. I mean, you know, so that won't fly. That is not going to be something that Google's very worried about, I don't think. There's just not an alternative that's viable.
We've also been covering a number of alternative, I call them the third wave, like your third wave coffee shops, third wave social media content platform sites that are doing phenomenally well, you know, with shoestring budgets, literally on single digit millions of dollars of funding, because they've been neutered by either the SEC or the media or fill in the blank to try to halt their ability to fundraise, you know, from traditional VC investors. But these sites are top 1,000 websites in the United States, have tens of millions of active users. If they didn't have a black eye on them because society is trying to cast them aside, even though they're wildly popular, these would be 9-figure, some of them probably unicorn valuation tech companies, get with the traffic and volume that they have. So we have seen private enterprise. Actually, I would say, you know, there are a number of really great alternatives. We've covered DuckDuckGo, Google search alternative raised $100 million a few months ago. You've got social media alternatives. You've got YouTube alternatives. It's not as mainstream as a Google or a Facebook, but I am also optimistically, rooting for these third wave social media and content platform startups that are continue to see an exodus from big tech to their sites. Don't know how familiar you are with those, but it really is very promising to see.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because however many years ago when Rupert Murdoch decided to take a risk on, you know, let's go after a new little niche market, a tiny niche market in America, which is half of the country. And that's the market for Fox News, right? And there was nothing targeting that half of the country before they just decided to launch their news channel. So Yeah, I would be happy for these companies to be successful. I think, you know, companies that go up against free, it's very difficult, and there has to be a reason for users to switch away from the current monopolies into these new channels. And maybe if people really are unhappy with privacy and censorship issues, maybe that would cause a movement. But yeah, I mean, I'm mildly familiar with DuckDuckGo and some of these companies, but not intimately. But I would be excited if they were viable, because if Facebook, Twitter, Google, Amazon, if they were not monopolies, the problem that I'm worried about would not be such a difficult problem, where you just have, a monopoly platform controlling the public square of information.
This is really an apolitical situation, right? This is about free speech and open conversation, goes to the fundamental principles of America, of the Constitution, of the Bill of Rights. And that's why you are seeing this exodus to these alternative sites. It's very difficult for them to go and raise money from your VC community and others for a variety of reasons. But a post here recently from Gab, where in the months, in just the past few months, they've had over 30 million new subscribers on top of whatever their existing user base was, which is not an immaterial amount of people, but still, Gab cannot have an app on the app stores because Apple and Google won't allow it, right? So they have all this usage, but you have to go on the browser, right? You can't use an app, which makes it so much easier and just a much better viewing and interactive experience. Parler, the other kind of social media company, which has now capitulated, their app was pulled off the app stores, and then AWS kicked them off of, they kicked off all their servers. So they had to rebuild their tech stack. So it's every step of the way, whether it's actually posting content free, posting your free opinion on the sites versus building a competitor. Every step of the way, these tech monopolies are battling you tooth and nail.
I think the problem is the standards that these companies are trying to use is, they call it misinformation. They constantly talk about misinformation or truth and falsehoods. And fundamentally, that is just incorrect. The standard is not whether something's true or false. The Constitution and the Supreme Court has repeatedly confirmed that falsehoods are protected free speech. So the standard has to be whether that speech is truly harmful or imminently dangerous. And that is the thing that, we're working on. And we wrestle with this standard because sometimes you find gray areas where, something might be possibly kind of dangerous, or maybe, it's just, for example, whether certain false COVID treatments should be promoted, that sounds dangerous. But medical studies talking about COVID, or political opinions, or fiery political speech are protected, and this is fundamentally the problem. And Clarence Thomas on our Supreme Court has said he is looking for a case, to adjudicate on this thing. And to the extent the idea that Parler had looser standards than Twitter is demonstrably false. You can find tons of false and harmful and, dangerous types of tweets on Twitter, but Twitter didn't get booted off of AWS. So it means these companies are following standards that are for business interests. It's politically expedient.
What can we do about this in the interim, right? If we're saying, hey, from our legislature, our regulators, not going to hold our breath on their ability to affect change. private enterprise, actually making some progress. And that's what I really loved about what you and the First and 14th Institute are doing here. What can we do in the interim of all of this?
So I think one thing is to raise awareness. Way back at the beginning of this discussion, we talked about nonpartisanship, and we've been reaching out to liberals who have been canceled because they're not liberal enough. So some writers on Substack, for example, which is an interesting business model in itself, and talking to these companies and talking to members of Congress or their staff about some models. And one of the models that we've been studying this and kind of testing the waters is, the finance industry is regulated not directly by the government, but the finance industry in 2007 created their own regulatory authority called FINRA, which was formed by NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange when they merged their enforcement and arbitration groups. And we are peddling the idea that FINRA could be a model for non-government regulation of online media that will help these companies avoid much worse heavy-handed government regulation, because we do not believe in government regulation. And I think one of the challenges for people who do not prefer large government involvement in industry is, how do we deal with censorship? Because we don't necessarily want the government directly involved in anything that, where it's a business, and they should not be involved in businesses. And so this is a kind of a quasi-government agency model. And FINRA is a model, one that has the scale to work. The budget, they have $800 million budget, thousands of arbitration judges. They have teeth. They can suspend financial advisors. They can suspend stockbrokers. They've meted out tens of millions of dollars of fines to financial companies. And so that is a model that can work. And Facebook has already demonstrated its interest in something like that by funding their own oversight board with a $130 million budget over 5 years. So they're willing to spend serious money on it. Of course, the oversight board is absolutely not an independent board. They're personally selected through some process by Facebook. And it's a kind of an interesting mix. Most, 2/3 international luminaries who some of them have come out and said, human rights might be more important than free speech rights. So they're not very sensitive to at least the US Constitution.
It's very curious. I mean, if anything, it just goes to show you that these tech monopolies are, effectively their own governments. They're emulating having their own Supreme Court function with this Facebook oversight board, which is, kind of hilarious. When it came down to the probably the key decision to say, hey, should President Trump continue to be banned from social media, they punted it. So that kind of that was the nail in the coffin, at least in my regard, for how effective that body is.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, they did do one good thing. They pointed out to Facebook, your standards are not transparent. Facebook has a lot of standards written about, their speech boundaries of what they, think should be censored, but they have nothing written about the enforcement actions. And, if you break this rule, what will happen? And if you talk to people who have had content blocked or banned from any of these platforms, generally what you get is an algorithm just says, hey, you violated a community standard, and you have no idea what you did wrong or how to fix it. And there's nowhere to go. And here's the only solution I've seen right now is you somehow have to get publicity. You have to find people who have big audiences and get them to generate awareness that you were unfairly censored, not because you did something dangerous, but because you did something that was disfavored, by these platforms for some reason. So if you can get on Tucker, or you can get Barry Weiss to write about you, or someone like that, then you tend to have a way to get unblocked.
Otherwise, you're silenced and no one will know. So it's it's a tough fight. I'm glad that you're fighting it, Mike. It's been great having you on today. We hope to kind of keep abreast of your progress and wish you all the best in this common battle here.
Very good. Well, thanks a lot, Alex, for the time, and enjoyed the conversation. And I enjoy your video cast as well.
Likewise. Thanks, Mike. That's it for us today on Winner Take All. Thank you very much for joining us and listening to Mike Matthys. I will talk to you soon.